Hello again. Thank you very much for attending our session on managing your employee mental health issues. I'm just doing a second recording of this because I understand some people struggled to see the slides on the call. So here's another version for you. So today we are going to talk about managing your employee mental health issues. The session is approximately 30 minutes long. And we're going to cover 3 predominant tips that you can use to manage your mental health issues within your workplace. We're not going to have time to go into things in huge amounts of detail. Obviously, it's only a relatively short session, but what we can do is give you 3 broad tips that you can implement right away within your organisation that should make managing mental health issues much, much easier for you. So, let's get started. So here on this screen is a very famous statistic, and this is all about how many people each year struggle with their mental health. And it states that each year that number is 1 in 4. Now this particular statistic dates back to a study that was done between 2007 and 2009. So it was quite a long time ago, almost 15 years ago now. And of course, our understanding of mental health over the last 15 years has changed a lot. In fact, it's actually got a lot better. Mental health is one of those areas within the clinical industry that actually has developed its understanding fastest of all, faster than many, many physical health conditions as well. So our understanding of mental health is very different to what it was 15 years ago, and subsequently the type of data that we collect and our understanding of that data, and of course people's understanding when responding to such questionnaires and studies has changed. It's improved massively, and as such this 1 in 4 number is a little bit outdated. But when it did come out, it was used by plenty of mental health charities and companies and things because it seemed really shocking. This kind of 1 in 4 number, each year 1 in 4 of us would look at it and say, really? Is it that high? 1 in 4? 1 in 4? Felt like quite a shocking statistic. Hence it got used a lot. These days, not so much. Doesn't feel particularly surprising to most of us, I don't think. And that, of course, is because the number is at least 1 in 4. And at the Smart Clinic, we were quite interested to know exactly what is that number. Is it still 1 in 4? Is that still accurate? Or have times moved on? So we did a study across around about 1,000 different organisations, and we asked all of their employees about their mental health history. And the numbers weren't 1 in 4. Spoiler alert. It was actually much higher than 1 in 4. In fact, it was closer to 3 in 4. 3 in 4 employees admitted to struggling with their mental health each year. In addition to that 3 in 4 number, a further 1 in 2 employees believe they live with someone who's struggling with their mental health. Now those numbers are huge. Much, much bigger than that 1 in 4, to state the obvious, but they're also very significant. But if I'm honest, I don't think they're greatly surprising. And that's because our understanding of mental health has developed over the years. And we've come to understand that it's not simply either I have good mental health or I have bad mental health. It's not black and white. It's not like I either have depression or I don't. You can't say that I either have a cold or I don't. You can't say that I either have tummy ache or I don't. There are varying degrees of it. You might have an incredibly severe physical illness. You might just be feeling slightly under the weather that day, might have a bit of a sniffle, and of course anything in between those extremes. Physical health is a broad spectrum from feeling incredibly well and incredibly healthy right up to, the opposite extreme. And mental health is the exact same. It's not fair to say I'm either fine or I'm not. It's a varying spectrum of how you're feeling. So you can have days where you might be feeling 10 out of 10, you could have days where you're only feeling 6 out of 10, you could have days where you're feeling 1 out of 10. But to simply say 1 in 4 of us will struggle with our mental health isn't really fair, because in actual fact, 4 in 4 of us struggle with our mental health. Every single one of us has mental health, which means every single one of us can struggle with our mental health. Some days we'll have good days, some days we'll have bad days. And don't get me wrong, some people have much more severe issues than others. Some will have lifelong mental health conditions. Some will just have, minor struggles. But we all have mental health, which means we all have the capacity to have mental ill health. So that's something that we need to make very clear. And as such, I would really heavily recommend you stop using that 1 in 4 number, because it just isn't really accurate anymore, and it certainly isn't helpful because it's not representative of the way that we should be discussing mental health. So, given that mental health is a thing, just like physical health is, we all know this already, and given that people can struggle with their mental health, just like they can with their physical health, it's incredibly important that line managers feel able and equipped to deal with mental health issues within the workplace when they arise. Of course, exactly the same with physical health. So do they? That's an important question to ask. Well, in actual fact, 95% of them say yes, I do. I do feel confident. If somebody comes to me with a mental health issue, 95% of us say we feel confident that we know how to respond to that employee who is struggling, which is brilliant. That's really, really good news. Yes, mental health is an issue. We all understand that. But yes, we actually feel quite well equipped to deal with mental health issues when they arise. So no problem, right? Yes, mental health is an issue, but we got it covered. What are we talking about today? Well, there was one more piece of data, and this was slightly more concerning. And this said that only 1 in 3 employees would feel confident approaching their management team or their line manager about their mental health issue. And herein lies the issue. It also represents the biggest opportunity to improve the way that we talk about mental health, and that's to get this 34% number up. Because of course it doesn't matter how good your management team are at dealing with mental health issues. You could be an absolute expert in the industry, but if only 1 in 3 of your employees would feel confident having that conversation with you, then it's only relevant to 1 in 3 employees, and 2 out of 3 employees are being left out. So we need to try and get that 34% number up, and that's what we're going to focus on today with our 3 tips. So hopefully that will be helpful for you. And hopefully that will help within your organisation to get that 1 in 3 number much higher, and to get your employees engaging with the management team more about their mental health issues. So the first tip is about effective and proactive communications. Bit of a cheat here, because we're talking about effective and proactive. That's kind of 2 things in one. But the reason that we do that is because any kind of talk about mental health can only be effective if it's proactive, because otherwise it's too late. And it can only be proactive if it's effective, otherwise you're not having the right conversation at all. So imagine you're sat in your office typing away, you're writing the world's best email, and somebody walks into your office and says this to you: I'm pregnant! Hooray! As a line manager, how confident do you feel that you know what to say next? I'm going to imagine pretty confident. You're going to be doing things like, you're going to be talking about pregnancy risk assessments. You're going to remind them that they're entitled to take paid time off for antenatal appointments. You're going to ask them to bring in a copy of the MAPB1 form when they get it. You're going to ask them what their estimated due date is. You're going to say congratulations. Pretty simple stuff. This is kind of page 1 from How to Be a Manager, this, isn't it? I'm guessing you feel fairly confident in that, hopefully so. Now imagine that same employee walks into your office and says this to you. Or this. Or this. Or this. Or even this. Now how confident do you feel that you know what to say next? Perhaps you still feel just as confident. Perhaps you've got your little checklist of things you want to talk about or questions you want to ask. Perhaps you feel absolutely on it, but perhaps not. Well, each year, approximately 840,000 people in the UK will get pregnant, mostly women, I understand. That represents around about 2.6% of the working population. So in other words, about 2.5% of your employees on average will tell you that they're pregnant this year. Now, if we look at that initial stat, the 1 in 4 people struggle with their mental health, which we already know is overly conservative, then an employee is at least 10 times as likely to be struggling with their mental health as they are to get pregnant. Arguably, you could say they're 25 times as likely because all of us struggle with our mental health. So can you honestly say that you feel between 10 and 25 times more confident in having that mental health conversation as having that physical health conversation? Hopefully. I hope so. But perhaps not. So one tip that I really like to give people, and you've probably heard this one before, is all about asking twice. It's a really simple thing that you can do, but it's about trying to promote that proactive conversation about mental health. Ask your employees twice. So when you came into work this morning, I'm going to hazard a guess and say you spoke to somebody or other and said, "Hi, how are you?" I'm also going to hazard a guess and say I know what their response was. I'm going to guess they said, "I'm fine, thanks. How are you?" "I'm good, thanks. How are you?" "Yeah, I'm not too bad. How are you?" "Oh, it's a bit cold, isn't it?" How, those sorts of things. It's fairly generic stuff. We bat the question away again. It's almost like a game of ping pong of politeness. Ping pong of politeness, I would call it. Because what that conversation really means is I'm going to extend a courtesy to you, you're going to extend a courtesy to me, yay. That's what that means. We're not really asking much about how somebody's feeling. We're not asking them about their current state of physical health. We're not asking them about their current state of mental health. It's just a polite exchange. So what you can do is you can ask a follow-up question that says, "No, I'm actually really asking about you. I want to hear the answer to the question." And you've got to be careful not to phrase this to say "I don't trust them," because that's not helpful, or "I don't believe you," or "your first answer wasn't good enough," or something like that. But what you can do is you can ask a follow-up question to ask a little bit more about them. These are just a few suggestions that I have that I quite like to use. My personal favourite is "What you up to over the weekend?" I think that one's a great one because it gets people talking a bit about their home lives, about what they've got going on at home. They're going to say things like, "Oh, I'm taking my kids to the park," or "Oh, I'm not going to do that much, I can't afford it at the moment," or "Oh, my mum's not very well, so I need to go around and look after her," or whatever it could be. What it does is it begins a conversation about that person. And when you begin a conversation about a person and about what they've got going on, you begin a conversation about mental health. So you can then start to pick up on the right cues and have a conversation thereafter. It's just getting people talking. It's relatively easy to start that conversation. Just ask the appropriate questions. I've just left a little quote from HSC on the board here. While I do that, another tip that I would give you about making sure that your communications are effective when you're talking about mental health is when somebody does present a mental health issue to you, don't be judgmental. Now, I know everyone says that, but no one really knows what that means. The way to not be judgmental is to not root around too hard for a cause for their problem. Because when you do, you can actually make them feel a lot worse. Mental health is a funny thing. It doesn't necessarily have a cause. Some people just feel rubbish sometimes. That's what mental health is. Depression, for example, doesn't necessarily have a situational cause. So imagine you're feeling really low today. You're having a bout of depression. You're feeling just a bit not yourself. And somebody says to you, "Why? What's causing it?" And your answer is, "Nothing. I just don't feel good." If that person then roots around any harder, and they say to you, but why? Why do you just not? There must be something causing it. What, what can I help you with? Is there an inherent issue? Is there something wrong at home? And your answer is still no, I just feel rubbish. That's actually going to make you feel worse. It's going to make you feel a little bit guilty, because you're going to start to feel, well, why do I feel this way? I shouldn't feel this way. I have, lots of advantages in life. There are people much worse off than me. Why do I feel this low? And then it's going to make you feel worse because you're going to feel guilty. What that person could have done, and they were trying to be helpful, so it's difficult to blame them. They were trying to show care towards you by helping to fix your issue. But actually what that person could have done is not tried to fix the issue and instead helped you with the symptoms that you're experiencing. A much more helpful conversation would have been, come here, let me make you a cup of tea. Should we nip out for a walk? Let's go and have 5 minutes outside and go and talk about it. Fancy a drink after work? Those sorts of things. They're helping to manage the symptoms by getting people talking and opening up a little bit more. Unfortunately, and I'm sorry to generalise, but actually the data does back this up, men are worse at this than women, and that's because men tend to think a little bit more systematically than women. I know this is only an average and there are always exceptions to every rule, but as an average, men will look for cause and effect more than women will, and as such they will say, well, the effect is somebody's struggling with their mental health, so there must be a cause. So let's look at the cause, we nip the problem in the bud, the effect goes away. Mental health doesn't work like that. It's not a simple algorithm. There might not be a cause. So rather than focusing on that cause, focus on the effect instead. So the second tip is all about signposting. Now, a bit of a home truth, I'm afraid, but you cannot cure somebody's mental health condition. In fact, in many instances, nobody can cure somebody's mental health condition. And that's because, as we've already talked about, mental health doesn't necessarily have a cause. So there isn't necessarily something to cure. Way back when, Winston Churchill used to suffer from what we now know to be bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression. But of course, the understanding of it was very different back then. Mental health was much more stigmatized and much less understood. Back then were the days if you struggled with depression, you were crazy. So he didn't really know how to describe his mental health disorder. So he used the analogy of a black dog. He said, I have a black dog. He's really loyal. He's always there. Sometimes he's big and bouncy and he jumps all over me to a point where I can't even stand up. Sometimes he's quiet and subtle and he skulks away in the background. But he's always there. He's very, very loyal. And that's what mental health can be like. You can have a black dog. And it's not about trying to get rid of that black dog. It's about trying to manage that black dog. It's about trying to manage mental health symptoms. And that's why we don't call this session curing mental health within your organisation. We call it managing mental health within your organisation. It's all about managing the symptoms. And one of the best ways that you can do that is understanding what your limitations are and having the resources to hand for when your limitations run out. By and large, you're not a clinician, I'm going to assume. You're probably not a doctor, you're probably not a nurse, you're probably not a psychologist, you're probably not a psychotherapist. You're probably a trained line manager in whatever your area of expertise is, or you're probably some form of HR manager. Which means that you've got a very specific set of skills, but generally speaking, they're not clinical. So you can have a responsibility up to a point, and then there comes a point where your skill set runs out. What you need to do is you need to have something to hand that helps when your skill set runs out. And that's all about having effective signposting resources. And here's something that you can go away and do straight after watching this. And it need only take 30 or 60 minutes, but have a Google, look at some local support groups, Obviously, I can only do national ones here because everyone's based in different places. But look at some local support groups, some local charities, some local resources, as well as some national ones, as well as some online ones. And create yourself a little black book. Literally, you can have a black book if you want to, or some form of spreadsheet or presentation or whatever, with a bunch of different resources that you can use to signpost people to when they're struggling. And go one step beyond that. Try it out for yourself. Download the app, join the Facebook group, watch the YouTube video, learn a little bit about it for yourself so that when you're recommending it to somebody, you can talk to them with a little bit of authority. You can say, I've tried this for myself and it's really great for X, Y, and Z. It might not be quite so good for A, B, and C, but if you're struggling with X, Y, and Z, it will be perfect. Just make sure when you log in, you do this. It shows that not only have you done the research, you also have tried it for yourself. And if you can try it, they can try it. And that will make them to feel a little bit more reassured that you're not just batting them away, that actually you're recommending something from your own personal experience or from your heart. Now up on this board is a bunch of national options. One thing they all have in common is they are all free. Yes, of course, allocating budget to these things is helpful because generally you're going to get a better service if there's budget involved. Those of you who are current Smart Clinic customers who have a wellbeing package with us, you'll know this already. The list of resources that you'll have with us, which is obviously a paid for service, will be much, much greater than you'd get from, say, the Calm app or, Mind or something like that. But nevertheless, if you don't have the budget for that, hope is not lost. There are still options there for you. And you might want a combination of the two. You might want some paid for and non-paid for services. But either way, create that little list of resources and have them to hand, because when somebody talks to you and you believe that your skill set has run out and they need clinical support, that clinical support is available. Brilliant. And then my final tip of today is all about reasonable adjustments, and this is where it gets a little bit HR-y. And I know that reasonable adjustments can be seen as a bit of a yucky phrase. We're not necessarily going to focus too much on the HR element of this. We're more going to focus on how this impacts the employee. Now, for those of you who are HR qualified, you probably know the next 2 or 3 minutes of this already, so feel free to fast forward this. But the phrase reasonable adjustments comes from what's called the Equality Act, which is a 2010 piece of legislation. The Equality Act comes from a series of different pieces of legislation, generally developed sort of from the early 70s, that all talk about tackling discrimination within the workplace. Just some of these examples are things like the Sex Discrimination Act, the Race Relations Act, the Disability Discrimination Act. They all merge to form the Equality Act 2010. And if somebody is covered by that Equality Act, as an employer, you're obliged legally to implement what's called reasonable adjustments. Now, today we're obviously talking about the disability element of that because this is a presentation about mental health. But the same, of course, does go for other elements of the Act too. But if somebody is covered by the Equality Act, and by the way, if you're not sure whether they are or not, ask your occupational health provider. That's what they're there for. They will be able to give you quite a good steer as to whether somebody's covered or not. They will also be able to give you a good steer as to what adjustments you might want to consider, which we're going to talk about in a second. One question that gets asked a lot is, within the phrase reasonable adjustments, what constitutes reasonable? Because that's a bit of a strange word. Well, it's not actually that subjective. It's fairly well defined. And the definitions are, number one, will it remove or reduce some of the disadvantages suffered by the employee? In other words, will it help? There's obviously very little point to making an adjustment to somebody's working pattern if it won't help. Secondly and thirdly, is it affordable and practical? As an employer, you can never be obliged to do something that you can't do or that you can't afford to do. If you simply don't have the space in your office, or it's not practical for a member of staff to be taking 2 days a week out to go and do something or other, or any other sort of elements that would detrimentally affect your business or your organisation to a point where it couldn't operate anymore or whatever, you can't be obliged to do something that you wouldn't consider practical or affordable. And fourthly, will it harm the health and safety of others? You should never do anything that would be of detriment to other people as well. If you can tick all 4 of those boxes, the adjustment is reasonable. So to go back to what we were talking about in terms of managing employee mental health, the way that you can use this to your advantage is you can get a list of potential adjustments, see earlier comment about occupational health, and then you can run through this with the employee themselves so that they feel engaged and part of the process. What that will do is that will help to stimulate a conversation with the employee about how you can help them and about how they can help themselves. So you can talk through a list of potential things that you can do to help. You can literally go through this list of 4 things, discuss it with the employee so that they know what adjustments you're going to do, which ones you're not going to do, what will help, what won't help, what you can do, what you can't do, and so on. That makes the employee feel involved in the decision-making process and helps them to feel in control and to get back on top of whatever their particular mental health concern is. Same goes with physical health, by the way. Now, of course, whether an employee or not is covered by the Equality Act determines whether or not you're obliged to make a reasonable adjustment. Even if they're not covered by the Equality Act, it's still a good idea to do this anyway, and to go through the list of practicalities and talk to them about what adjustments you can and can't make. Some people call this support. What support can you or can't you implement within your organisation? And that's pretty much it. So just to very quickly recap. Number 1, ensure that your communications about mental health are effective and proactive. Number 2, ensure that you have some signposting resources so that when your technical abilities run out, you have some clinical abilities to hand. And thirdly, ensure that when you're implementing reasonable adjustments, you're involving the employee in the decision-making process and making sure that they feel in control just as much as you. That's everything. Thank you so much for listening. Apologies again if you were on the original recording of this and you couldn't see the slides, but I hope this gives you something to look back on. Thanks again for listening. Really great to talk to you. Take care.